What is up, guys? So we are back again with another episode, and in today's episode, we're actually not joined by the beautiful Gary McGowan. He is otherwise occupied. He has a lot on. He's doing college stuff, triage stuff, and yourself, like he actually has a life as well. So it becomes hard to manage all those things. So we got the second rate Brian, or second rate Gary, in here. We have Brian Hennessy, as I say, but Brian Angusa is his real name. If you're ever trying to search him up on social media, you've probably had a hard time. Brian, how are you?
Well, Paddy, thank you. I think if you get Brian and then OH, I'll probably be the one to come up. So not that difficult.
Brian and then USA, it also comes up because obviously that's the end of your name as well.
Yeah, so it's easy work.
USA.
Yeah, I get that all the fucking time, man. When I have to spell my name for somebody, like, oh, you said USA.
You just punched him then. Anyway, Brian, what has been going on in your life since we last had you on the podcast? How is work? How is life, training, etc.?
It was quite a while ago that I was last on the podcast, so lots has happened since then. Work is crushed. All the clients are really getting after it. It's fantastic. You love to see it.
That's good, because that was a test. You're not fired yet.
Well, I mean, you can see the testimonials that are going out there on social media. If you're on social media, it's going fantastically, as it should. Life is obviously going pretty well also, as much as you can live it in the lockdown conditions. And training was going very well. Obviously, I injured my adductor last week, as you know. So no more rolling with Gary for a couple of weeks anyway. But I did my 4 hours of cardio yesterday, and that was fun. So yeah, we adapt and overcome.
You're getting your cardio in now because your resting heart rate was absolutely fucking abysmal. And if anyone else is in that same position, look, we've done an entire podcast series on cardiovascular adaptations and cardio in general. Do recommend. And obviously we do coaching. So if you do need that help, like we've been helping Senor Brian over here, get his, I won't even tell you what number it was at, getting his heart rate under control, his resting heart rate, getting his aerobic fitness into a good place. If you need help with that, we're here. But anyway, look, we're not here to talk about that. We're not here to talk about your life, Brian. We're not here to talk about my life. What we're here to talk about is to continue this, we'll call it a fat loss series that we've been doing. And in the last few episodes, we've been talking about calories, metabolism. And what often happens in this discussion is you find yourself falling into the trap of thinking purely physiologically, right? You're thinking about the processes within the body. You're thinking of, like we were talking before about, like the thermodynamics of stuff. It's like, oh, like what are calories? Like, why do we need calories? You might even go a little bit beyond that and you start thinking into like the macronutrient composition or the micronutrient composition and all these other things. We'll call them like, the physiological or the nutrition science stuff, right? You can get really wrapped up in that. And look, I fucking love biochemistry as much as the next person. I'm in for that conversation. However, we have to, especially if you are a coach yourself, or you are trying to get results yourself, right? So if you're in either of those positions where you're like, oh, I want to get some fat loss, or you are someone that ever coaches people for fat loss, you have to couch all of that information in the wrapper or the blanket of this stuff doesn't happen in, like, the discussion is not just about calories. The discussion is about human actions, right? That's what we're talking about. And we can call that psychology, we can call it, habits, we can call it whatever. But in reality, I don't care what you fucking call it, because we just need to know how to, first of all, use that to our advantage, but then also to understand it so that, we have a better idea of the process of fat loss, of getting results, etc. Right? So we don't want to get caught up in this like false god worship of, oh, just get your calories right, just get your macros right, and all is good. That's it. That's all you need to do. And anyone who's ever tried to diet, they'll tell you that that's clearly not the situation, especially if they try to diet without a true understanding of all that calorie and macro stuff. And it's kind of like they end up in, like, we'll call them restrictive diets. it's probably better for you to understand the psychology then, so that you don't really fucking shoot yourself in the foot, right? So just initially there, Brian, what are your thoughts on that, I suppose, in terms of thinking, like having that switch? Because I know, obviously, look, you coach people on their nutrition. So you've definitely seen this play out multiple times. You've definitely heard stories of this play out multiple times. And then also this switch had to have happened to you at some stage in your nutrition journey, we'll say, in terms of understanding this stuff. Like, what are your thoughts around that, viewing nutrition from the lens of we'll call it psychology? It's a little bit more encompassing than just the psychology, but we'll call it psychology, right? Like, yeah. What are your thought processes around that? Is that something, am I just talking out my ass here? Is this something that, people should be looking at? Is this something that you think is like really relevant? Is it something that, people need to understand before they start dieting? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that if it was as simple as the way you just described it physiologically in terms of the biochemistry, which it is, it is as simple as that, but it's not as easy as that, right? So on paper, you could just give someone that information and say, look, go ahead, start your diet. You're going to do fine because this is all you have to do. These are the 3 to 5 requirements you have to satisfy to get the result that you want, right? And then everyone would be walking around super lean. We'd have no issues with people being overweight or obese or having issues with their relationship with food or themselves, etc. So it's obviously not as easy as that, right? So that's when the whole psychology, behavior science, if you want to call it that, comes into play, because if you're not setting up your behaviors to manage the things that you've just described, you're going to have a very hard time with it. What happens if you start having a very hard time with it? Okay, do you stick to it? Probably not. What happens when you start failing essentially over and over again? What's the psychological implications of that? Which is how we have to step back and start to look at this from a psychological standpoint and see, okay, well, if it is as simple as that, then why isn't it that easy? So what actually goes wrong? Like, why can't people just be given, oh, okay, well, here's what you need to know about calories, here's what you need to know about macros, if they've gotten that far. Some people only get as far as calories. I've worked with a lot of people in that context. So they come in and they say, in the screening form, yes, I've tracked my food before, but I never paid any heed to macronutrients. It was only calories. So I was like, I knew that calories are important. So this is what I tried to stick to. Yet here I am needing help because it didn't work, or often is the case, it did work, but it didn't last very long. Right. So we have to think about, why is that the case? Where do people go wrong in this process? Because they obviously have the right information in a lot of contexts anyway, not in all contexts. Like, some people have just been completely steered away from what they need to be doing, right? We know that. But like on paper, for a lot of people, it's like, okay, you knew what you had to do. You knew what requirements you need to satisfy to get the results. And either you were able to do that, and it was probably a grind and a struggle, but you got there, and then what happened, right? So there's this, we talk a lot about the after diet, that's how important that is, and the kind of maintenance phases being as important as the actual dieting phase. But we have to look at, okay, so where are people actually going wrong here? And let's try and address that. And that's often a psychology / behavior science discussion.
100%, yeah. And it is, I guess it's really annoying, because it basically makes dieting harder. Like, if you're someone that's trying to learn about this stuff, you're like, oh fuck, now I have to not only understand all of the nutrition science, I have to understand psychology, behavior change, behavior science, whatever. And it's like, are we just overloading people with information? And look, realistically, like, we coach people, so we give them what they need, in terms of like, what do you need right now? What's the best little nugget that you need that's going to get you forward the quickest, the most efficaciously in terms of your overall journey. So we've had to learn all this stuff. So I already know how frustrating it is when you don't have someone there to guide you. But unfortunately, like, if you're trying to do this stuff on your own, whether, again, coach yourself or like learn this stuff so that you can coach, people better, you're going to have to go through some like trial and error with understanding psychology, behavior change, all that kind of stuff, and layering that on top of the nutrition science. Because look, it doesn't work one or the other. Like I've already said this, like it's not an a la carte menu when you're talking about nutrition. Like you can't just pick and choose like, oh, I like that little bit, I'm going to bring that into my diet, or I like that little bit, I'm going to bring that into my diet. It's like, no, you have to do the set menu. The set menu is you have to understand somehow, whether it's again through portion control, through whatever, it's like you have to understand calories, right? You have to understand macronutrients. And again, I don't mean you have to like literally track calories and macronutrients, but you have to have a diet modality that understands or at least encompasses that stuff, right? But then also on that menu is like, you have to understand the psychology. You have to understand the human habits, the human behaviors. You have to understand all that stuff. It's on the menu. You can't not choose it, you know, and you can't only choose it. Like you can't only focus on the psychology, right? And we often see that where people are like, oh, I really need to work on my relationship with food. You know, it's like, yeah, 100% you do. As an individual, this is something that you need to work on, but you can't do that completely dissociated from the context of eating a nutritionally well-balanced diet. You know, like you can't just go, oh, I'm nourishing my mindset and you're eating crap. You know, it's like that. They don't go hand in hand. Like I would argue that most people do not have clarity of thought or clarity of action when they're not actually nourished. You know, it's like, think of someone who, I don't know, they're going through starvation, right? Do you think that they're thinking at their best? Do you think that they're acting at their best? It's like, no, obviously they're fucking not, right? Same again, like, do you think you're genuinely acting at your best when you're hungry, right? Probably not. Do you think you're acting or thinking at your best when you have just eaten that fucking packet of crisps or, you know, all those sweets, all those jellies, whatever it is? Like, do you think you feel at your best? You're able to be your best in society, be your best in the world? No, you don't. So it clearly matters if we're trying to nourish our thinking, our mindset around nutrition, you know, our relationship with food, we'll call it. Like it's one of those things where it's like it's a chicken or egg race, because we actually have to have some of the fundamental nutrition stuff dialed in so that we can actually have the clarity of thought to be able to build a better relationship with food, right? And it's a really hard thing to deal with, because like, how do you actually go about doing that? Look, we'll dig into that later in the podcast, but it's like, how do you actually go about helping someone's nutrition while they're trying to deal with poor relationship with food? And again, it's just difficult. And to give you kind of context for this, like we'll give a few examples, because I think it segues nicely in terms of what we're looking at here. So like, bringing it back to the conversation we previously had on on the podcast on this series in terms of like metabolism, calories, right? So people, if you haven't watched it or listened or watched the last 2 episodes, go back and listen/watch them. And because we talk about, you know, the fundamentals of the diet, we're really getting into it right now, right? But I do want to have this podcast in it because you really do have to think of the psychology when you are viewing all that stuff, right? But let's just go into it from the physiological processes here, right? So let's imagine you're someone, you go, oh, I want to lose some weight. I want to lose a little bit of fat, whether it's a lot of fat, maybe it's a little bit of fat, whatever. You want to lose weight, right? So what you do is you go, oh, I don't know anything about dieting, right? Because that's the position that most people are in. Obviously, they've heard lots of things. You know, you might, as you said, someone might be like, oh, I know calories are important, or someone might be like, oh, I just know about like healthy foods, like, you know, quote unquote healthy foods, like whatever. We have some fundamental knowledge of diet, like we have to eat food. So regardless of your situation, your status, whatever, you probably have some ideas about the diet, right? So you go, oh, I want to engage in a fat loss diet. I want to lose some weight, I want to tone up, blah, blah, blah. You have all those best intentions about this. And again, we're not even touching on the psychology of like thinking about that a little bit deeper in terms of like, you know, a lot of people say they need to lose weight, but it's not like, that's not the thing that's going to actually help them. You know, it's like, that's not going to make them more confident. That's not going to fix all their issues, blah, blah, blah. But let's assume good intentions. Let's assume it's like, okay, this individual, they would actually get better results if they did lose weight, right? Right, we're there, right? What often happens is this individual will then go, okay, I don't really know much about dieting, but I know that you have to eat less and move more to lose weight, right? That's what everyone says. And we've talked about it on the podcast. It's like, this is the fundamentals, right? What often happens is this individual will then, because they don't have a full grasp on it, they will either excessively restrict, right? They'll either cut out like food groups. They'll cut out, you know, just massive amounts of calories. It's like, oh, well, if eat less is important, then surely it's about how less, like how little can I actually eat and still, you know, survive on a day-to-day basis, right? So they really basically punish themselves, right? And you often see this, like, say someone starts with us, and I know you get it all the time as well, Brian. They start with us and they go, oh my God, I can't believe I'm able to lose weight on so many calories, you know? And it's like, yeah, you were actually always able to lose the weight on this many calories. You just weren't doing it previously because you had this idea in your head of, oh, I need to restrict myself as much as possible to get results, or to get results as fast as possible. And unfortunately, due to a few things, for a few reasons, this isn't necessarily the case. And one of the things is, first of all, there's metabolic consequences to dieting, right? And what we always say, what we always talk about is like, you can't look at a diet intervention, a nutrition intervention, without looking at some of the harm that is potentially, like, you have to look at it like a medical intervention. You know, it's like everything has pros and cons. This is not just an intervention that you do that has no cons, right? It's like, no, there are some cons associated with this. And one of those cons, if you do go into a like very restrictive diet, or even just, you know, a mildly restrictive diet, you are going to get some metabolic consequences. Now, some of these metabolic consequences, especially initially, are potentially really beneficial. Like, you might get some like increased insulin sensitivity, some, you know, better blood sugar regulation, blah, blah, blah. Like, you could get all the health benefits associated with dieting, right? But one of the consequences is that you do get some metabolic slowdown, right? And this is not like, people always think like, oh, I've broken my metabolism. And like, that's not the case. It's just, this is a normal process. Like, you start fidgeting less, you start moving around less, you start doing XYZ less. Again, we've talked about it previously. And as a result of that, the calories you're now on, you aren't losing as much weight as you thought you would. And especially when you were on a very large magnitude of a deficit, like if you try to eat 1,000 calories less, you're going to hit these consequences much sooner, right? So we have to factor that in, that you're now going to be a little bit more frustrated because you're going to be trying to lose weight and your body's fighting back against you, right? But another way that it fights back against you, we'll call them some sort of like, you know, neuroendocrine and, you know, just endocrinological responses as well to lower calories. And some of these are just increases in hunger hormones, right? And obviously that makes sense because you eat less, you're generally hungrier. Like, if you haven't eaten in a while, you're hungrier, right? But this is particularly hard when you're really trying to be restrictive, because the hunger kind of builds, right? And your ability to satiate yourself is lowered, right? Again, there's all these neuroendocrine things going on, leptin, ghrelin, like we talked about this stuff on the podcast previously, right? So you're getting all these you're getting all this pushback from the body effectively, right? And this leads to a situation where you see initially, you're like, oh man, I lost 2 kilos this week, 3 kilos, 5 kilos this week. You see this initial like, great, we're getting great results. I obviously know exactly what I'm doing. And then all of a sudden this pushback happens. And then what often happens is we find ourselves in this kind of binge restrict cycle, right? Where people have eaten themselves into this kind of like, we'll call it a starvation position, where the only way they know how to diet is low calories. They just eat very little food. And then what happens is, or potentially they're still eating enough food, but they're doing it in a really restrictive manner in terms of, they're like, oh, I don't eat any of these foods that I enjoy. I don't eat chocolate. I don't eat XYZ, like insert whatever food it is that you enjoy. You're like, that's completely gone. It's just very restrictive, right? And what often happens then is people find themselves in these binge restrict cycles, right? So they stick to their diet 6 days per week. And then on the 7th day, they eat everything in the house, right? So they were in 1,000 calorie deficit, you know, Monday to Saturday night rolls around, and now they're in, when you view it over the week, they're like, oh no, you were actually in a surplus of 1,000 calories, right? Overall. So it's like, you actually start gaining weight, which is a really terrible position to be in, because for 6 days out of 7, you're really restricted. So you feel like fucking shit, right? Like, you're like, I feel like I'm restricted. I feel like I've been pushing myself with this diet. I feel like I have been really on point with everything. And then you effectively undo it all in a day, right? And potentially, again, you start restricting further then. You're like, oh, well, if 1,000 calories wasn't doing it the last time, like, you don't obviously tackle the binge eating, because why would I tackle that? That was the anomaly. That was I only do that once. You know, the actual issue is clearly what I was doing the 6 out of 7 days. It's not the one day. Like, again, logically, you could get to that position. You go, oh, like, that's the anomaly. Don't focus on the anomaly. Focus on the everyday stuff, right? So then you go, oh, I'll just drop calories by another 200, whatever, right? And then all of a sudden next week, the binge is bigger. You're like, oh, well, like, why is this, right? And again, you don't address the binge because you're like, oh, well, like, again, it's still the anomaly. It's like, it's happened twice in 2 weeks, but it's still, that's, you know, 2 out of 14 days, it's like, that's nothing, right? And then you basically argue yourself into this, or like rationalize yourself into this, like binge restrict cycle where you eat less, you feel guilty, shamed, frustrated, and then you're like, oh, fuck the diet, blah, blah, blah. And then you end up in a position where you've got no results. You feel like you've been working hard for 12 weeks. You feel like you're in a shit position. You feel like you're broken. You feel like a terrible person. Like you're like, oh, like dieting should be easy. Weight loss should be easy. Everyone on Instagram, social media, blah, 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 they say it's just calories in, calories out. And I've been doing that and they're able to get results. So either I'm a genetic outlier, or these people are lying, or I'm just a fucking shit person and I can't do anything right, you know? And like all of these emotions go around your head, and like that's not encompassed in this calories in, calories out argument. This is not encompassed in this like discussion of metabolism. And like, while we can explain it metabolically, we can explain what like metabolic consequences or metabolic adaptations are happening, or we can explain like, you know, what signaling hormones or peptides or whatever are going on. Ultimately, it comes down to, it still affects your psychology, it still affects your habits, your all that kind of stuff, right? And like I always call this the health and fitness merry-go-round. And again, you can get on that merry-go-round multiple ways, right? Again, it could be restriction, it could be excessive exercise, it could be whatever, right? It could be like, oh, vegan dieting did it to you, you know, fucking carnivore dieting did it to you. Like any of these restrictive diets, is like they did it to you. Maybe like I've had people on calls and they've done everything, you know, it's like, oh, I've done every single restrictive diet. And it's like, okay, well, have you ever tried not restrictive dieting? You know, it's like that, like, clearly the restrictive dieting isn't working for you. So how about we don't restrictive diet, right? And we'll come back to that kind of stuff in a second, right? But we're on this kind of health and fitness merry-go-round where, you know, you are pushing yourself around. Let's say it's a self-directed or a self-propelled merry-go-round. You have to like, you know, basically like use it like a scooter and, you know, use your foot, push it around. So you're doing a lot of work to get this merry-go-round to go around. But after, you know, however long, 12 weeks of doing this diet, going around this health and fitness merry-go-round, you find yourself back at the exact same starting position, potentially even further back than what you wanted. And again, we always refer to that as like, you see these before and after pictures, but you rarely see the after picture. And it's like, what happens then, right? So my question to you, Brian, is like, how do we get off this health and fitness merry-go-round, right? Because you probably help, well, in Ireland anyway, like you probably help more people than most people, coaches in Ireland, have helped with this stuff, right? I don't know about England. I don't know about any of the other English speaking world, but I know you have a lot of clients, you know, and I know you've been doing this for a while. So I know you've been able to help a lot of people in this situation. And look, anyone who reads your testimonials on our website, like they'll be able to see this in action, right? So how do you actually go about dealing with this, right? And you can take this from two perspectives. You can take it from the perspective of someone has come to you like they often do, and they're already on this health and fitness merry-go-round. They're trying to get off, right? They could have been on it for the last 10 years, 20 years in some cases, right? So you can take it from that perspective, but then also, and I think it's important to do this, how do we set things up correctly from the start so we don't ever get on this health and fitness merry-go-round? Because I know a lot of coaches are listening to us, and that's what they're thinking as well. They're thinking like, yeah, I want to be able to help these people that are already in this situation, but they're also thinking like, how do I not fuck up my clients? Like, how do I get them to a position where they can get results without having to basically get on this health and fitness merry-go-round? So that's a big task for you there, Brian, but take it away.
Yeah. So if someone is coming in this position where they have essentially tried all the diets, and, you know, you literally, you see this all the time with people who sign up. It's like, I've literally, they'll list it out for you. I've done all of these, like ranging from like pretty awful fad diets to maybe less awful fad diets that are still misinformed and then misinforming people as a result. But it can be as simple as looking at, okay, well, what have you been trying for your whole life, essentially, with dieting? What have you been trying? Has that looked like, okay, going super low calories, being super restrictive? Okay, how about like a paradigm shift where we don't do that initially? And we'll see what that looks like. Because chances are you spent weeks, you spent months, you spent probably years in a lot of cases trying that way. So does it make sense that we may go and try something else, right? Because, you know, essentially you're just not getting the result. The thing's not working for you. You're going down doing your super low calorie diet, and then you're binging it back either at the weekend or after, 2 weeks or whatever it may be, however long you can hang in there until, you hit the ejector button and then you're out. And then you have to obviously, come back in. You're like, okay, I need to get this down. And as you put it so well, it's obviously not the one day, the anomaly that's the problem when it is the problem. And the restriction, if that is what you're doing and it's not working, then you have to be able to consider that, oh, maybe that is actually an issue, right? In spite of what you've been told about, calories are important. So less is obviously better in terms of trying to get the result. And like, again, on paper and physiologically, that's true. If you can adhere to that and not end up binging and not end up just gaining back whatever weight you might have lost. And then it's the psychological response to that as well, because as you said, they end up feeling like a shit person. A lot of these people, especially people who engage in binge eating on any sort of regular basis, like their self-esteem is already lower, right? As a general tendency, it's already lower. They have perfectionist tendencies. Okay, so on the latter point, in terms of perfectionism, it's trying to move away from that as well. Okay, so if you're a person who has created all these rules for yourself, where maybe your low calorie diet is 1,000 calories a day, and you eat 1,010, then that equates to failure in your mind. That's literally what you see in these people. So we have to have a conversation about, and a lot of this in practice for me looks like, kind of a cognitive behavioral approach where I'm, going back and forth in a dialogue with these clients and saying, okay, look, if 1,010 calories is going to be detrimental to your progress here, why is that the case? All right. So is 1,001 calories an issue? If not, why not? If it is, why is that the case? So I'm trying to unravel what they think they know about the process, right? And and I'll offer my input. And it's like, hey, look, based on my education, my experience, this is what might happen, if you eat 1,010 calories instead of 1,000, right? So we start to unravel that sort of illogical or irrational or just misinformed thinking about what is actually required to get you a result here. All right, so if 1,001 calories is not a problem, why is 1,010? And where is the line? Where does that line come up? So what actually is important? Okay, and then people get into talking about this. So like, we rank, or we allow clients to rank their nutritional adherence, on a scale of 1 to 10 in their check-ins. And I had someone last week say, it was a 7 or an 8 out of 10 or something. And like, to me as the coach, I was like, that looked pretty fucking good. So I can ask him the question, okay, why wasn't that a 10 out of 10? Or what would it take for it to be a 10 out of 10? And the answer was, it would have been a 10 out of 10 if I only ate healthy foods. Okay. And then, this dialogue is ongoing because only recently. So the question is like, okay, so why is it? So then I can ask him something like, okay, so is it possible that you would, move away from your goals by only eating healthy foods? If you're eating 3,000 calories a day and you're meant to be on 2,000, is that, you are, by your standard there, eating a 10 out of 10 nutritionally, right? Because that's what he told me. Okay. And it's not, it's obviously not like trying to catch people out and be like, what, this is what you said. All right. It's not like a fucking interrogation in a courtroom. This is me, coaxing them to the point where they can see, okay, maybe it's not down to eating just healthy foods, because then we get to the point, it's like, okay, I could score myself a 10 out of 10 on my adherence, yet I would not get a result. So what else is important there? So these are the kind of discussions that we'll have with people. So it's trying to dissect that stuff. And, you start off in a lot of cases kind of gently, right? Because if someone comes in, this is another recent example, if someone comes in and their background is really obsessive over tracking and really obsessive over calories and macros, and I say to them, okay, yeah, we're just not going to do any of that now. All right, that's, that's gone. You're not tracking anymore from tomorrow. Like, that is tough for someone to come to terms with. So it's going to be a gradual, sort of graded, gentle approach where it's like, okay, let's start with you not tracking your non-starchy vegetables. Okay. And and that was met with a like, are you sure response? Like, are you sure that's okay to do? And I'm like, yeah, okay, let's just go with this, and you'll see what happens. Because again, it's not tracking your vegetables or not tracking your vegetables is going to let you down. It's the hyper focus and restriction and perfectionism involved in that's tied up in that is letting you down when you put a toe out of line, and then it results in a binge, right? Because the more kind of food rules and more restricted you are, the easier it is to go wrong, the easier it is to fail, the easier it is to then say, fuck it, I'm off the wagon now, so I may as well just go and eat all these foods. Because the literal psychology is that if you're in the type of restriction where all these foods are bad and I can't eat them on this diet if I'm going to be successful, if that is your thinking, then it's literally a case of, okay, I've eaten some chocolate now. This was on my list. I shouldn't have eaten chocolate. I will fully intend not to eat that again until this diet is over, whenever that may be, right? It could be never, right? So if you fall off, you say, well, I fucked it now, so I may as well make the most of it, right? Because I'm never going to eat chocolate again, right? That's the idea. That's the goal here, essentially tied up in this weight loss piece. So you're just going to go hard at it, and you're going to binge, and you'll eventually pull yourself back to say, okay, I need to get back on track now, because this is obviously not good for my goals. And that is essentially the merry-go-round that you described. But in that case, like, okay, why are all these foods bad? What is inherently bad about them? So a lot of this is just a dialogue, being willing to put, having those conversations with people, right? And you see it's like a common theme in every single testimonial I have. It's like the level of detail, the level of communication was fantastic, right? So it's not essentially special, but it's just sitting there and being able to, ask them good questions, get them thinking. It's not diving in to say, this is the answer, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to offer answers if I feel someone's gone off track, or if they're not sure, I'll often say that. It's like, okay, I want to see what you think about this. I have some ideas, but let me see what you want to put forward first. So it's having those conversations that are really the crux of actually making this work and getting those sort of breakthroughs. Okay, so if all these foods are off limits, why is that the case? What is so bad about them? Because then someone will say, okay, maybe it's nothing bad about them, but they're high calorie foods, so it's easier to stick to my diet if I don't have them. And it's like, sure, but what makes you think you can't, portion control them appropriately? If you're not in that mindset of, I can't have this, therefore, if I do, I must eat tons and tons and tons of it because I will never have it again. So it's taking those foods down off those pedestals. And this is where I'll bring in all that mindful eating stuff, right? Because if someone is just focused on the numbers on terms of their calories, they lose all sense of like regulation of, appetite and satiety. Because if a diet is set up properly, like the hunger should be manageable. Okay, because what I find is that people eating when they're not actually hungry is one of the biggest issues for them, right? And if their diet patterns and habits are not set up properly, like, if they're eating low protein and they're eating low amounts of vegetables and their general food volume is low, yes, they're going to be hungry all the time. If they're not sleeping properly chronically, yes, they're going to be hungry all the time. But in the people that I'm working with here, it's often eating when they're not actually hungry, where food is trying to fill some other role, right? So it comes into, emotional regulation, and that being a major limiting factor for people, as opposed to, it's like, oh, I was too hungry, so I overate. Okay, so that is going to be the case, absolutely, if someone's gone super low calories. So then we just have to bring them out of that, because you can talk to the person about this. Like, look, if you're trying to eat 1,000 calories a day and then you eat 4,000 on Saturday and Sunday, you're not really eating 1,000 calories a day. So what does that mean? That means you're actually eating this much. So where could we actually start and try and like level this off across the week for your intake and get you away from that super, super restrictive approach? So one thing that I would recommend to coaches listening to this, because that's part of the question that you asked, is that, try and not let people get hyper focused on just calories and macros. Let them maintain this sense of, okay, let me see how hungry I actually am here. Let me stay tuned in, if I can give one piece of advice, listen to this. Like, either you try and stay tuned in and stay mindful. And this is why the mindful eating works, because it forces you to check in with yourself. Okay. Because a lot of people are just using food to numb emotions, to not experience emotions, or to just, avoid feeling any way negative. Right. I think you say this a lot, Patty, where it's like, we have this broad range of human emotions that we can experience for a reason. So we don't need to essentially shy away from any of the bad ones. Like, maybe, if we could experience them, maybe they have a purpose or a reason that we're actually going to experience them. So it's not to get hyper focused on just calories and macros. Let's keep the other components of this in there as well. So then people have to stay tuned in and more self-aware, essentially. And that's kind of a key point for a lot of people. Because if people just attach themselves to, okay, calories, macros, that's what's important, I'll go and do that, they lose that other side of it, right? And then because they'll be lacking that self-awareness, they won't actually know they won't necessarily know what's going on and why they're falling off track. And then, ways to get around that perfectionism piece, which is super important. It's like, okay, you don't give people hard targets in their calories and macros. Like, so I think for the most part, me, you, and Gary will use ranges with people, right? Because then it's like, okay, just try and work within this range. It's very, no longer then do you have this, okay, my goal was 1,000 calories, ate 1,010, therefore it failed, right? And then that allows you to prioritize, or at least incorporate, the mindful eating aspect. So it's like, if I don't have this specific number that I know I have to finish on at the end of the day, then what am I left with? Oh, I'm left with thinking, okay, how hungry am I eating all these meals? What's my mood essentially like? How are my emotions today? How is that going to impact my decision making? Right, and this is where obviously the psychology of it all comes in. So essentially, it's moving away from the thing that has not been working for you for so long, right? If restriction is the issue, or if the restriction is the super common theme, as you said, because if you look at it that way, the restriction is the common theme when you're on that 6 days a week, and like you said, the binge is the anomaly. So maybe it's the thing you're doing all the time that's the issue, right? So if that's the issue, then moving away from that is a good start. So, and then in terms of not like breaking people, obviously you need to have a good background, like knowledge of their background and dieting history, because like, absolutely, I will use what would be called super low calorie diets with some people, but they're generally people that have shown to me that they can do a longer term fat loss like phase sustainably without any issues, without any binge eating, etc. And then maybe we finish that fat loss phase, and then maybe we do a maintenance phase, and then it's like, okay, let's just maintain the results with a aggressive cut every now and again, right? That's okay, right? Because that's part of the plan. But the issue is that most people want to start there without laying any of those foundations for their actual behaviors, for their actual habits. So if you don't know how to eat enough protein on a daily basis, if you are a person who does not eat a vegetable, okay, from on any of the days that end in Y, then that is going to be a problem for you. So that is where it comes into, we can start you on the path, right? Let's start you with maybe if fat loss is a mild deficit, right? While we work on these things. Okay, or just just start with a few weeks of a foundational phase, depending on obviously the case and the person. Because if you're not doing all those things already, then you're going to have a very tough time going down to lower calories. Okay, the people who do well on lower calories are the people who are experienced dieters, right? And I don't mean experienced in terms of being on this merry-go-round. I mean experience. It's like, yeah, I've done this, I've gotten results, I've maintained the results. Then you are a candidate for the more aggressive, lower calorie approaches. And then also you know what to expect, right? So you know what to expect with hunger, you know what to expect with, the physiological downregulation of like meat and different hormones and things, or the increase in hunger hormones. So if the super restrictive approach has not been the thing that's working for you, let's obviously it's very dependent on the case, because if I look at someone's diet, it's like, okay, they're basically eating in no way to achieve satiety, then that's the first thing to work on. And you can put them in a little bit of a deficit, that'll be manageable, right, for them, while they build up that competency in those sort of habits, and they'll actually, you know, and a lot of this I think comes down to like feelings of self-efficacy and confidence, and not telling yourself that you're a piece of shit because you keep failing over and over again. Like if you get, like, I had a girl email me yesterday. She's like, I just pointed this out to her. I was like, look, looks like you're in a really good place now. There's been no binging for a while. And I think we're 6 weeks without a binge. Whereas previous, actually a really good example now that I think of it, like previously her experience with dieting is I'll stick to my calories for 3 to 4 days and then binge. And you know, we're on that very quick, fast merry-go-round, like it's fast moving. It's like 3-4 days of diet, a few days of binge, 3-4 days, and just repeats. So, you know, we're 6 weeks, no binging, right? We've done some of the emotional regulation stuff, right? She needed some help on the awareness of that side of things. The diet is not overly restrictive, right? Because she's super active, so it, you know, it shouldn't be. You know, we've tweaked, like she had a good background knowledge of like how to eat well, but we've tweaked a few things in terms of like increasing nutrient density, increasing food volume, right? She's very, very busy, so she's eating like a lot of small meals and snacks and stuff during the day, so not necessarily poor or low in nutrients, but kind of low in food volume. Like the meals generally weren't big enough, so we kind of tweaked some things there. And there you have it, like 6 weeks, absolutely no issues. Fat is now coming off her, like, you know, weight's dropping, measurements dropping, everything else is going really well, you know, because we addressed those things that need to be addressed. So that is extremely long answer to your question, Paddy.
No, that's 100% good. Like I always think as well, and it always freaks people out when I say it. I'm like right now, whenever I diet, I'm like, the thing that stops me from dieting is basically boredom with food choices. And what I mean by that is I'm like, say I have to diet, like I'm relatively sedentary these days because we haven't had Brazilian jiu-jitsu, you know, training isn't as calorically demanding as it potentially previously would have been. And obviously, look, my steps are down, etc., because you know, there's fuck all to do, except like I literally go on like
and you're working hard.
Yeah, 2 or 3 walks per week. So I'm like fucking working hard, right? And as I said, an Instagram post, and people obviously asked about that as well. Like I basically work about 70 hours per week, right? Because there's a lot of work going on in the background in Triage, which will come to fruition in a while. But anyway, look, that's another story. So like for me, the thing that actually stops me from dieting is never hunger these days, right? Like I'm rarely hungry. Now, obviously, some of that is the fact that I'm just busy, and like, you know, the idle hands are the devil's playthings. You know, it's like it is a common enough saying, but it is very applicable to the diet, because like people generally start eating more when they're bored, or they're like, oh, like in the evening I'll have something to eat with, you know, just sitting in front of the TV, etc. And so I do have that going for me. Being busy has stopped me from that kind of stuff, right? But the way I have my diet structured, I'm like, I'm not hungry. Like I'm full. Like my diet is satisfying. So even if I'm in a calorie deficit, it could be a 500 calorie deficit, you know, relatively aggressive. And I'd be like, yeah, look, it's not hunger that gets me. The thing that gets me is that like I like to cook with my girlfriend, or I like to, you know, eat certain things. And like, if I'm not able to eat those, I'm like, oh, fine. Like I can do it for the fat loss, you know, that I potentially want to get. But I kind of get a bit bored with it after a while, right? So that's the only thing that stops me from continuously dieting. And people don't really, when I say that to people, they kind of like get taken aback, because for the vast majority of people, the thing that stops them dieting is that they feel overly restricted. And like, obviously I'm saying I feel restricted because I want to eat other foods that I'm not able to, but I'm not like overly restricted. And also I'm not hungry. Like the thing for a lot of people is they feel they have to be hungry when they're dieting. Like I could literally lose 10 kilos. Well, maybe not right now, because maybe I do have 10 kilos to lose. Who fucking knows? But like, I don't have 10 kilos to lose. So maybe like, you know, I could lose, if I was heavier, I could lose 10 kilos and not feel hungry on that diet down to lose those 10 kilos, you know? And if someone else was to lose 10 kilos, they'd be like, oh man, I'd be starving after, you know, 6 weeks of this, 8 weeks of this, blah, 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 blah. But the fact that I have the fundamentals so squared away, like I'm like, I know exactly how to make my meals like satisfying. I know exactly how to effectively portion them out across the day, so that there's not periods of time where I'm like, oh, I'm really hungry now, or whatever. Or, you know, like say obviously like when I'm back training with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and stuff, like I'll be training twice per day, you know, not every day, but some days, right? So I need to know how to fuel myself for those 2 training sessions. So like I already know how to do all that stuff. And it's that fundamental, like the hard and soft skills of the diet. Like once you have that stuff nailed, like the other stuff really falls into place, and you don't find yourself in these kind of like, first of all, really restrictive diets. And then you also don't find yourself ever being hungry. And like that's surprisingly effective at reducing the urge to binge, right? Just having like the fundamentals layered. But then when you actually start digging a little bit deeper, like you're saying you do with your clients, where it's like, okay, let's actually analyze what your thoughts are around this, right? You start to open up like all of the little, like you start to shine light on all the little dark spots in your brain with regard to nutrition, with regard to things. It's like there's nowhere for these things to hide once you've illuminated them. And then all of a sudden you start to realize that, oh, I don't need to be restricted. Oh, I don't need to binge eat. Oh, I don't need blah, blah, blah. Like I know you've done a load of, like you've even like taught us like different techniques and stuff in terms of like, oh, here's a little tool to manage the diet or manage thoughts of binge eating, you know, like say, for example, you know, like using like, what do you actually, like the mindfulness practices, basically, you know, it's like, how do you actually feel when you eat these foods? You know, like what's the texture like? What's the food, you know, like how does it feel in your mouth? Those kind of things. And it's like, yeah, these are all like nice little tools, tricks, tips, whatever, right? Like, but they're not the main show. It's like, these are little like cherries on top once we've got the majority of the diet, like the fundamentals locked in. And then we start to layer on a deeper thinking about the diet in terms of like, oh, you think you need to be perfect with X, Y, and Z to be on point. It's like, no, you actually don't, right? And like, obviously you don't just say like, no, you don't need to be perfect, but it's like, you actually show them that you don't need to be perfect. It's like, okay, let's actually elaborate on that. Let's actually explain that. Let's actually see, again, like you said, like what would happen if you did eat, you know, bad foods, quote unquote bad foods. It's like, what's the outcome that you think is going to happen? And then we explore that, you know? So it's like, you have to, if you want to get a good understanding of this stuff, you have to layer on the psychology. Like, yes, the fundamentals of the diet are extremely important. You have to get them down as well, right? It's like, again, it's not an a la carte menu. You have to choose both of them at the same time. And it's just hard. And like you were saying there, it's like you coaching someone, like, you know where to look, like, you know where, like using that same analogy of like where to shine the light and be like, look, here's the dark corner over here. This is where you're hiding that thing that you don't even realize you're hiding. It's like, boom, shine the light on it. We deal with it, you know? And I think that's hard for, first of all, coaches to do because they maybe haven't experienced that. Like they haven't, like we get a lot of coaches that like we coach a lot of coaches and then they see from the process, they're like, oh, fuck, like, this is how we actually deal with the diet, or this is how we deal with training, or this is how we do whatever, so that we get the best result, right? Because I like to think at least that we have like, you know, world-class coaching, and like that's what we aim to offer anyway. And I know like I've got coaching from like loads of people before, and I know we provide a better service than a lot of people that are supposedly, you know, world-class coaching, right? So I'm like, what does that actually look like? And when you're coaching, you get coaching yourself and you see that and you go, oh, fuck, like this is what it's actually like. Like that's a feed forward loop, right? And it is hard for coaches to be able to do that themselves, you know, in terms of like, you've had to learn all this stuff through multitude of courses, through talking to people, and then obviously through experience as well. But obviously, like that's taking you however fucking, we'll say 10 years or whatever, you know, it's like coaching yourself as well, you know? So it's like, this is taking you that long. And like, if someone gets coaching off you, for example, like they can get that short circuited, like, boom, there you go. There's 12 weeks, you know, this information. Like, yeah, okay, you don't know all his tips and tricks, but it's like, you know, a lot more. But it is hard to teach yourself this and to learn this yourself. And like, that is something that we obviously aim to help in the future. But right now it's like, if you are a coach, the best recommendation that I would give to you is like, yes, start reading about this stuff. Yes, start learning about this stuff. Like Brian, for example, you do consultations. Like you do consultations all the time. It's like the other coaches can learn from you. I know there's other coaches as well. Like they're not even affiliated with us. Like I know Shannon Beer, like fantastic. Like if someone was saying to me, they're like, well, where do I go to learn about this stuff? I'd be like, Brian or Shannon, go to either of those. You know, it's like they're probably the two best, at least that I know, you know? So I'm like, go to them. Like that's the reason why like Shannon has been on the podcast more than you. But it's like, you know, it's like there's a reason for that, because she's good, right? So I'm like, outsource this stuff. It's the easiest, the fastest way to learn, and otherwise you will go down a load of rabbit holes that potentially are just divots that, you know, you shouldn't have gone down the rabbit hole. There's no rabbits down there, you know. But if you are an individual that's trying to lose weight, it's a lot harder to do this stuff yourself, right? Because as a coach, look, you can you're a problem solver, right? And while, yeah, we don't want to necessarily just solve all our clients' problems. And I don't mean that from a perspective of like, oh, we want to keep them as clients forever, so don't solve all their problems. I mean, like, we want them to be involved in the problem solving process. I want them to be their problem solver. I don't want them to need me long term, you know? And so they need to learn the skills of problem solving. But if you are an individual trying to coach yourself, it's just very hard to get through this. Like, you don't have someone in your corner asking you these questions. You're also probably unsure of the fundamentals. You're like, oh, I heard about calories, macros, blah, blah, blah. I'm trying to do that. And then your execution of that is, we'll call it wrong. Like, it's not wrong. It is informative. It's informing you some way, and it might not be perfect for what you want or need, but you know, it is informative, right? But like their fundamentals are not nailed down. And then it's a case of like, oh, I don't even know how you would dig your way out of that just as an individual. Like, you're listening to this, like, obviously you could listen to everything Brian just said there in his little rigmarole speech there, where it's like, you could listen to all of that and you could take that on board. You can, you know, try to implement some of this stuff, try to ask yourself questions, try to think of things a little bit differently, but it is hard. You know, it's not going to be easy. It's like what you said earlier on. It's like, you know, dieting is easy, you know, or dieting is simple, you know, but it's not easy. You know, it's like the fundamentals, understand calories, understand macros, fairly simplistic. It's not hard information, right? It's like, yeah, okay, cool. Here's your calories, here's your macros. This is food selection. Boom. See you later. You know, it's like you could teach someone that fairly quickly. However, the actual implementation of it is hard. And then when you start trying to layer on like the psychology, all the stuff that's been going on previously in your life, you know, maybe you are an emotional leader, maybe you eat when you're stressed, maybe you eat blah, blah, blah. It's like trying to deal with all that stuff is also hard as an individual. And I would love to say that I have an easy fix for that, but I unfortunately don't. So unless you have an easy fix for that, Brian, which I don't think you do, what else do you think someone as an individual, right? They're just trying to get a handle on their nutrition. Like, how can they set themselves up for success, right? Let's say they don't have any binge eating history, like, and they're just coming to this and they're like, right, I want to start losing some fat. Like, what is the process for them? And then also, I suppose as a secondary question, like, someone comes to you and they're like, yeah, I have a little bit of a history of like binge restrict cycles. Like, I want to start basically from a fresh slate. Like, how do they start the process properly?
Before I get into that, something I want to add is that for the people who, in my experience, like, I've noticed a pattern that the people who have the biggest issues with this sort of thing are the most resistant to doing the things that is going to help them with this. So I mean more so there in like kind of disordered eating behaviors, where people are very resistant to actually doing mindful eating exercises, like really resistant. Like it could go on for like 2-3 weeks where someone's like, no, I still haven't done that. And then that raises like so many questions. You have to think, why so much resistance to just a little, like a 2-minute exercise where you're just going to pay attention essentially. All right. So there can be a lot of psychological sort of baggage there as well. And you may not want to face up to all that stuff, all right? Depending on what the actual history is. Like, it varies, like from severe to not so severe.
So this is the thing, like, minds can be really fucking dark, you know, like whatever's going on in your life, like most people don't want a light shone on their dark areas, you know, like they don't want to find all the cobweb filled dark corner of their mind that they've been fucking burying deep down. And that is something that, like, if you are a coach, that's something that you're going to have to deal with. And like, realistically, most coaching certificates, they don't equip you for that. And like, there's nowhere I'd love to be like, oh, this is the course you go to, this is the whatever you go to that can teach you that, but it's not. It's like, even psychologists struggle with this stuff. It's not like that's their like, or psychiatrists or whatever. It's like, that's their fucking whole shtick. And it's like, it's still fucking hard for them, you know? So it's like, do you think you're going to get a little course, 12-week course or whatever, and they're studying for 4, 5, 6, whatever years to get the knowledge of this stuff? It's like, it's probably not going to be easy regardless of your background, you know? But anyway, yeah, sorry for interrupting.
Yeah. So that's just the point to make, that the people who maybe have the most issues with this sort of thing, especially when it comes to like emotional eating, or even just trying to figure this stuff out, because, you know, if you can see what your limiting factors are, like if you look at your diet on paper and it's like, all right, that's pretty well put together. You know, so, you know, if it's not, then that's where you start. Like, you know, you start by getting some awareness of like, you know, when am I most hungry? So, okay, I'm going to eat bigger meals then. I'm going to eat my meals slowly and mindfully, ideally, so that I get more satisfaction from them. My protein intake is going to be high. My fruit and vegetable intake is going to be high. Like they're all the basic things for you to work on. You know, fiber intake. They're all the basic things for you to work on. Like if your diet on paper is not fairly up to scratch, like that is going to be a big limiting factor, even if there's all this psychological stuff layered on top as well. So if you have that pretty well put together, which a lot of my clients will, yet they still struggle. So then we have to move on and look at the psychological stuff where, okay, so what are the limiting factors? You know, is it because you immediately turn to food when you feel stressed out or emotional, etc.? And then once you help a client to deal with that sort of thing, give them some tools to try. Like I may not be able to resolve it for them. You know, they may need to be referred out to a mental health professional. It does happen. Once you start to resolve those sort of issues, then it's like, okay, the fucking log in the river has just been lifted out with a crane, and now everything's flowing nicely. All right, so that whatever the limiting factor, whatever the log jam was, you know, assuming your diet is good on paper, then you have to start looking for what that might be. You know, and then that's where the actual fucking self-awareness comes into it. Because if you don't realize that's like, oh, I go and smash a load of, you know, junk food when I feel stressed or when I have an argument with somebody or some sort of confrontation, you're never going to, you know, see that log for what it is. Right. And that's why I put so much emphasis on this mindfulness, on this self-awareness stuff. Because you just need to understand yourself a little bit better and how you actually behave and why you behave that way. Okay, so to actually answer your questions, you know, if someone's going to get started and they have no issues, it's a case of, you know, you need to have obviously the requisite knowledge of what's important for it to help you achieve your goal. You know, set some behaviors in place to then, or behavior goals in place to then work on. So it's all that stuff I just mentioned a second ago with like, what does a good diet look like on paper? All right. It's that sort of stuff you need to get sorted out. And obviously there's the lifestyle aspects, you know, how active are you? You know, what are your step counts like? What's your sleep like? What's your stress management like? Because all that stuff obviously interplays, as we talk about all the time. And then I suppose I've answered both questions like with that interjection where, so if someone does have some of those tendencies, like sort of eating tendencies, then they need to go and get into figuring out why that might be. But like I said, and like you said, it can be very, very difficult to do yourself, right? So the people who are going to find that easy to do are probably people that don't have any issue with it. Because like me and you, it's like, oh yeah, we like being introspective. Okay, it's not an issue to go and sit down with a pen and paper for 5-10 minutes and just kind of check in, see what's going on, try and resolve something. And like I said already, it's the people who have the biggest issues with this stuff are most resistant to doing that sort of thing. And granted, it can be hard to do by yourself. And you may not want to do it by yourself. If you have some sort of past trauma that is a limiting factor here, you maybe don't want to open that can of worms, right? Maybe not by yourself. Maybe you want to seek out some professional guidance, and maybe even they won't go there because it may not be necessary. Like I think people have this idea of like therapy or counseling that's just going to rip off all the band-aids and expose all their wounds and then start salting them up and be like, yeah, no, you need to work through the pain though, like to get through this. But often like you don't have to, you know, go and dig all those wounds out. Like you can work around it and still get yourself into a better place. All right. So that's a bit of an aside, but just it's a big misconception I see about actually seeking help from a mental health professional, that like it does not just mean that they're going to go and salt your wounds, right, and force you to confront all that stuff. You know, maybe a little bit, maybe some of it is relevant, but chances are you still be able to get some help without having to go through something that like is an emotionally tumultuous process.
Yeah, like using your analogy earlier on of like, you know, the log in the river, it's like a mental health professional can be a crane driver and they can be the one that just completely pulls the log out of the river. And like that would be, you know, tackling things head on and being like, right, let's shine the light on the dark corner. Let's get this fucking trauma out of the way, whatever. But also maybe they don't need to be that crane driver. Maybe they just need to give the log a little push. So now it's, parallel to the river, and the river can still like flow around it, and you can still get progress. It's like that's what they're doing. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be like, right, we're going to have to fucking drag this, because people think of it like they're literally going to have to drag the log out. It's like, this is going to be rough. There's going to be fucking splashing. There's going to be fucking whatever. It's like, no, like it doesn't necessarily need to be that. It can be just a case of, let's just put this back into a better place so that life can run a bit more smoothly, while we slowly start cutting this log down into more manageable pieces until it's eventually gone.
Yeah, so I like that. And then, like, in terms of actual practices that may be helpful here, it's like, okay, maybe a meditation or mindfulness practice, right? And like all this stuff is going to force you basically to tune in to yourself a little bit more. So journaling, I like. Obviously this is easier done with another person. I think you did a post in that sort of theme where like actually talking to people and communicating is an important part of like the human experience, and that's exactly part of the reason. So like mindfulness practice, some journaling, just to anything that is a practice where you have to say, oh, I have to actually go and check in with myself here. So even like build that into people's food diaries. So like how is your mood when you're gonna have this meal? Like it's not really about like what was your actual mood. It's that process of saying, I have to ask myself this question now several times a day, right? And that will help you get to a better understanding and more self-awareness. So then you can actually see where those limiting factors are, and hopefully go and address them. So like all the stuff we talked about today, you can go through that process, get pen and paper, say, which are my foods that are off limits and why in each case. Now, is there going to be an element of you maybe fooling yourself going through that process? Maybe, especially if you're misinformed, right? So if you don't have the right knowledge, the right education, it can be hard to do this stuff by yourself, right? Unless you're like really into like rational, logical thinking, like we are. A really good book that I like on this is the Happiness Trap, which is essentially the self-help book based on ACT, which is acceptance commitment therapy. And Shannon's a big fan of that, as am I. So that can be very, very useful. It's a short read, it's an easy read, a lot of good stuff in it, a lot of good stuff about like values, and again, just trying to understand a little bit better what makes you tick, and therefore that informs your behaviors most of the time,
Yeah, thinking fast and slow is also a good one, because it talks about like the intuitive thinking versus the more rational thinking. And what often happens, especially with like binge eating, like we'll call it like disordered eating, what happens is you often use the more intuitive thinking processes because they're quicker, right? They're very much the heuristic type thinking. It's like, oh, like hungry, eat food. It's like that's intuitive, right? Whereas like, again, rationally, you might be like, oh, I'm hungry, I'm going to delay eating the food now because I actually want to eat later on with my family, friends, whatever. It's like you can use more rational thought. And like, again, a lot of this is just about learning more about yourself, learning more about how you actually think, how you actually interact with the world. And this is why, like we always say, I'm like, look, you should read broadly. Like you should read everything, especially with regard to how humans have acted in the past. And like, it doesn't, like, I obviously like history, and like a lot of that is like you focus on the terrible times in history. But I'm also like a really big fan of just like, I just want to know how people lived. I want to know how they thought. I want to know what made people like tick, like what was going on in their life, like how did, I don't know, fucking even on like, adventures and stuff. And like, how did people think when they were encountering new peoples for the first time? Like, what was the thought process? Like what was going on? And like, I think even just doing that, like if you like trying to understand people, there's huge value in that. But obviously, if you're trying to help yourself, it can be hard to put yourself in those situations, being like, oh, what would I act like? Because I know fucking how I would act, in a lot of situations. So that's it. When I read books or listen to books or whatever, I'm always like, what would I do in that situation? And then I'm like, what would I do in that situation if I was actually true with myself. You know, it's like, oh, everyone always wants to think that like they would have been the person that fucking hid the Jews in Nazi Germany. And it's like, really, would you? Because like half of you that said that, and that were thinking that, were very happy to be like, oh yeah, I'd rat out my neighbor about not getting, like, they're not doing their lockdown stuff over the coronavirus. And like obviously it's fucking not the exact same thing. I'm not saying it is at all, but I'm like, you have to monitor those thoughts, because like if you're someone that would happily rat people out for little things, you know, when it's, and like people would say like, oh, well, I'm doing it because I want to keep myself safe. I'm like, yeah, that's why people were ratting out the Jews in Nazi Germany. It's because they were keeping themselves safe. You know, they're like, I don't care if my Jewish neighbor down the road gets fucking rounded up. It's like, I'm looking out for myself, you know? So it's like, those are the thought processes. Like we can all believe that we're going to be the shining beacon, her hero, courageous, whatever. But in reality, it's like, we're probably going to be the fucking evil ones. No, I fucking would be. Like, if I'm honest, I'm like, I definitely would be, you know? I'd be like, yeah, look, round them all up, execute them, you know? That's going to be me. And like, that's being honest, you know? I'm like, I'm like, I know they're the kind of fucking mental traps I would fall into, you know? So like, you kind of have to be honest with yourself. And a lot of times, like, the person staring back at you is not the person that you think you are. And that unfortunately means that you have to confront that. And you just thought, oh, I was just trying to get, you know, a better diet, lose some weight. And now all of a sudden you have to confront your own fucking terrible sins. The fact that you are an evil person, you know, because we all have this belief. Like, and again, people like obviously have turned away from like the church and stuff, but we still harbor the same beliefs. Like, we all believe like children are innocent, you know, when that's categorically false. Like, children are born evil. Like, some of them are definitely born evil, you know. And like, we believe it from the church because they have like the spark of divinity. Like, there's always like a little bit of God in all of us, like the, you know, whatever, the Holy Spirit or whatever, you know. But it's categorically false. Like, there's some children are just fucking born evil, right? It's just within them, right? And if you have to confront that you might be one of those people that are actually evil, you know, and like, that can be fucking hard. Again, when you just came into this process thinking like, oh yeah, I just want to lose like 5 pounds, you know. It's like having to actually sit down with yourself and reflect on yourself. Like, that can be tough.
Yeah, like if you see someone getting the shit kicked out of them in town or something by a group of people, are you going to be the one that steps in and is like, hey, no, fuck that, like, and try and save them?
I fucking love a good knock, so
but then but then it's like, oh, but you know, they pull a knife on you, get stabbed, and then what? It's like, that's,
you get to die and go to Valhalla. Like, I don't see any issue with that.
Yeah, warrior's death. Amen.
But yeah, look, that's.
I wish on this heavy note.
Yeah, I wish the podcast had like a like, here's a to-do list of exactly what to do, and obviously Brian has provided, hopefully, I think anyway, some like action points for people to go forward. But what I do want to really drill in, especially as we're going to go forward with the rest of this kind of fat loss series, is that like, you can get very caught up in thinking about the physiology, but you have to remember that we're humans. You know, it's not all just rationality, logic, and, you know, scientific, like, oh, here's this biochemical process and this does this and this does this. It's like, no, like, you have to actually realize that we are humans, we have human emotions, and some of them are enjoyable, some of them are not enjoyable, and you just have to navigate the situation, navigate life as best that you can. Anyway, look, we're gonna round it up there, or wrap it up there, I should say.
So got rounding up people.
Yeah, I was just like, it's already in my mind, thinking about going out and doing some things now. You know. But before I just fully wrap this up and whatever, how can people get in touch with you, Brian, if maybe they have an issue and they're like, oh, like, I need to talk through things with something, because obviously, or with someone, I should say, because obviously, look, you offer 2 services through us. You offer like consulting, and then you offer like coaching. So like, if someone was looking out to get either of those, like, what's the process for you?
Yeah, I mean, so you can reach out to me on Instagram, which is at Brian O'Hengisa. You can email me at brian@triagemethod.com. You can get in touch with me by going to the website, you know, triagemethod.com. You know, if you happen to message Paddy or Gary or message the Triage page on any of the social media platforms, chances are you will be able to get in touch with me. So any of those media, it will work well. Yeah, pretty simple. Lots of options.
Fantastic. Yeah. And obviously you do have spaces available. So I know myself, like this is coming out tomorrow, which is I want to say the 10th of May.
Yeah.
But I know Gary, he previously had like 5 spaces available. He now has 2 spaces available. I have 1 space available. So like if you're looking for coaching, like now is the time to get in, because once they're gone, and I know you do have a few spaces available, but obviously look, they're filling up fast. If there's a roster, there's a specific number that you have and that you can, afford to have. And unfortunately for people that need help, it's like, you need help now, you have to get in now, because that roster is not always going to be available, right? So if you are interested, look, there's information in the info box, wherever it is, whatever app you're listening to this on or whatever, it's somewhere, it's probably below it, whatever, right? You can look at the links, you can go in, look for coaching, it's on the website. We do obviously have a newsletter as well. Gary always sends that out every week. So if you are interested in just learning more about what we do, maybe this is the first time you've come across us, the newsletter is a good place to start. We do appreciate that people, subscribe on YouTube, especially, but also in terms of like wherever you listen to your podcast, especially like Spotify and stuff, like subscribe. We do also really appreciate when people share the stuff on their stories, right? Because that genuinely brings the podcast to a much bigger audience than would just like stumble across it randomly, And so if that is something, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, like that was a great podcast, share it on your story, literally tag us, we'll reshare it, so it's, win-win, like you'll be on our story. Wow. But no, genuinely that does really help with the whole visibility of this. So if you are enjoying the podcast or whatever, maybe you're just jumping in and out a few episodes here and there, or you're a regular listener, if you could please, share it, tell a friend about it, that really does help,
Yeah, we help more people, and that's the whole point.
Exactly. And like we are actually expanding quite a lot in terms of we'll call it the Anglo sphere, because we have a lot of listeners in England, and we have a lot of listeners in America, and we have a lot of listeners in Australia. And obviously, look, we're an Irish company, and so that's always, nice to see. Basically bringing back the British Empire, apparently. So that we just need to get like some people in India. Like we actually do have quite a few Indians that listen to the podcast, so that's always nice to see as well. It's like when you see like random places across the world, like obviously India is not fucking random, but like to us, I live in Ireland, like obviously like India is fucking across the world, right? So it's like it's nice to see that like people in like Sri Lanka, people in fucking Kazakhstan and stuff, it's like they're listening to the podcast, so that is always appreciated when people do share it. And look, if you are from wherever you are, and you think the people in your country, people that follow you on Instagram, social media, whatever, would also enjoy the podcast, like just give it a like, give it a reshare, give it a whatever, right? Anyway, look, I have nothing else to say. Gary, your fucking name is Brian. Brian, do you have anything to say to your adoring fans before I wrap this up?
No, just to echo all the stuff that you just said there, man. Share stuff if you find it good, if you find it useful, so that we can help more people, expand the reach, because we all got into this business to actually help people. So, we could be off doing very different things right now if we hadn't had that inclination. So more people we can help, the better we feel about ourselves and our life choices. So
and that's all it is. So you're just saying that this is a completely selfish endeavor. You just care about feeling good, is it?
100%.
And I'm going to end the podcast on that, because you're getting fired after this.